Welcome back. So, if your inner voice has ever gotten the best of you, you'll want to turn up the volume for our next guest. In his new book, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head and Why It Matters and How to Harness It, psychologist Ethan Kross provides tools that can help us reduce negative self talk and have better conversations with ourselves. We welcome to the show, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you are a world leading expert on controlling the conscious mind. And one of the things you say is that inner voice is like a superpower, which is a big word, but that superpower can turn into a curse when it turns into negative self talk. So, when does that switch happen?
So it happens when we experience problems, particularly really emotional ones. When that happens, we turn our attention inward to make sense of them, but we often end up spinning instead. We ruminate, we worry, we catastrophize. We experience what I call chatter, which are those negative thought loops that turn our ability to use our mind to solve our problems into a curse rather than a blessing.
Yeah, you point out in the book that we are currently living through one of the most chatter provoking times of the century. So let's talk about how this pandemic is affecting our own internal dialogues.
Well, the pandemic is doing two things that are acting like fuel to propel our chatter, which is number one, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. We don't know what's going to happen. And number two, we don't have a whole lot of control. And so those two ingredients can really get our negative self-talk firing in ways that can be really catastrophic. When you add on to that the fact that I think in both of our countries we've been dealing with economic uncertainty, political discord. There are lots of ingredients here that feel like we don't have a whole lot of control, and that can make it challenging for people to deal with the conversations they're having with themselves.
I love, Ethan, that you call yourself a mind mechanic. And in this book, you offer literally tools on how we can change that chatter in our head. And one of the things that you start with is the idea of distancing through mental time travel. How exactly does that work?
Well, so this is a tool that I actually use a lot to deal with COVID and the stresses that it causes. When we experience chatter, we tend to zoom in really narrowly on the awfulness of what we're experiencing. And one natural antidote to that is to step back and focus on the bigger picture. And so that can take the form of traveling in time 9 months from now, thinking about how are you going to feel once we're vaccinated and back to work. I think about, being on a beach, sipping a pina colada or three, playing with my kids. And what that does is it makes it clear that what I'm experiencing right now, as awful as it is, it's temporary. It will eventually end. And that gives me hope. And we know that hope is a powerful bomb when it comes to the negative inner voice.
You yourself have admitted that you still, even though you're an expert on this field, you still experience sort of this negative chatter in your mind. And you've talked about this kind of idea of distancing yourself. So let's talk about these distancing tools and distancing yourself through self talk. What does that look like exactly?
One of the things we've learned is that people can benefit from trying to coach themselves through their problems like they were giving advice to someone else, and to actually use their name to help them do that. So if you're struggling, you might think, all right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? With the caveat, don't use Ethan, use your own name. What that does is that it allows us to use language to help us think about ourselves like we were another person. And that gives us some mental space, some distance to help us weigh in on the problem more objectively, which can be really helpful for managing chatter.
Those are really interesting. I feel like I've done that intuitively when I've been trying to distance myself from that internal chat. I'll go into that kind of third person. And you say that again, it's like you can even further that by using the word you instead of I. Why is that so effective?
Sheryl Sandberg, the Facebook executive, when she lost her husband several years ago, after mourning for about 30 days, she wrote a blog post that was really interesting. She described her experience not in the first person, but using you. She wrote something to the effect of, when you lose someone you love, you don't know what to do. She's talking about her own very personal experience, but not using I. She's using the word you. She's essentially using the word you to refer to the world in general. She's saying, when anyone loses their husband, anyone's heart would jump out of their body. Anyone would have trouble dealing with it. And so that's another way of using language to give us some space from our experience. And in her case, what it's doing is it's making it clear that she's not alone in dealing with the adversity that she's dealing with. This is a common feature of how we all struggle, and that can be useful too. So we call that the universal you.
When we're in a negative thought spiral, there might be an instinct to go and unload on a loved one. But you say that, that might not always be your best course of action. And in fact, that approach might be a liability. So where does talking to other people when you're having this negative chatter go wrong?
So there's a very common popular belief, as you're saying, that when we're upset, when we're experiencing chatter, we should find someone to vent our feelings, just get it out. And what the research shows is that when I vent my feelings to you, that makes you and I feel really close and connected. It strengthens our friendship bonds. Like there's someone there who's willing to listen and empathize with me. Great. That makes me feel good in the moment. But if I'm just venting, it doesn't give me any perspective. It doesn't help me change the way I'm thinking about the experience in a way that nips my chatter in the bud. So instead, the best kinds of conversations for managing chatter do two things. They let you talk about your emotions and express yourself to someone else. So that's good. We want that empathic connection. But then at a certain point in the conversation, the person you're speaking to nudges you to kind of think about the big picture and broaden your perspective. And those conversations, those are really useful for helping us not just connect with other people, but work through the problems in ways that let us move on with our lives.
So Ethan, if simple venting isn't good enough, it really sounds like you're pointing towards maybe some forms of therapy over others. What's your perspective on that?
Well, there are certain forms of therapy that emphasize venting, and by and large, they have not been shown to be very effective. For example, shortly after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, there were a lot of people who thought that what survivors should find people to just unload their emotions to. Debrief is what it was called, critical incident debriefing. And in fact, over the 10 years after 9/11, there's a lot of work done which showed that those kinds of interventions weren't actually helpful, and in some cases were harmful. The best kinds of therapy, empirically supported therapies, do very much what we're talking about. There's an empathic connection established between a therapist and a client, and then the therapist helps the client shift their perspective, challenge their thoughts. The point I want to make, though, is that we don't have to, if the chatter is really extreme, by all means, go and find an empirically supported therapist and work with them. But for many of the everyday kinds of chatter experiences that I think we all struggle with, what you want to do is just be really deliberate about who you talk to. Find the people in your life who are good chatter advisors. And in the book, I talk about what features they have and how you can be a better chatter advisor to someone else.
I love that. So you also say that seeking out awe-inspiring experiences is a great way to sort of quiet that chatter in our minds. So what role does awe play in calming our minds?
So awe is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast that we have trouble explaining. I felt it when I watched the Mars rover land on Mars. I have trouble understanding how we figured out to travel between planets and safely land an SUV somewhere else. When you have that kind of awe experience, what science shows it does is it shrinks our concerns, right? We feel a whole lot smaller when we're contemplating something as vast as interplanetary travel. Now, you don't need, importantly, to watch a Mars landing to experience awe. You can get it from lots of different places. Looking at a great piece of art, taking a walk in a green space, though that may be more difficult for your viewers as it is for me in Michigan. You can get it from watching your kid, a home video of them taking their first steps. And so the advice is to find what gives you a sense of awe. And if you are experiencing chatter, try to have those experiences because they can help.
You've given us so many great tools to sort of help with the chatter in our minds, but some people might be still listening and thinking, I just want to silence that voice completely. So why shouldn't we fantasize about having a chatter-free mind?
Well, I think it's okay to fantasize about a chatter-free mind, but it's not okay to fantasize about an inner voice-free mind. The ability to talk to ourselves is an amazing gift. It's a tool. It allows us to problem solve, innovate, and create. When people lose their inner voice, when they have strokes, for example, that make it hard to use language, those people really struggle. So I think the challenge is to figure out not how to rid ourselves of the inner voice, but how to rid ourselves of chatter, the harmful manifestation of it. And the good news is that there are lots of science based tools that you can use to help you do that.
Really cool insights, Ethan. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing a lot from your book on the show. And that book is entitled Chatter. It is available everywhere. Go and get yourself a copy, and we'll be back after this.